afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com and also WFOV, that's over there at 92.1. And we're glad to have both audiences with us. And we're adding a new flavor today. We are adding a live feed to Facebook. And I was laughing when I came in the studio. I wasn't aware that we were going to add Facebook today, but I was laughing about it because Facebook threw me off 2 years ago. And now this is a way of getting back at them. John, don't blame me for it. John did it.
That shows cohesiveness and unity there. Blame him. Okay.
So I'm back on Facebook without through the back door approach. I'm very glad to be here today. We're coming to you again at 2 o'clock, and we'll be here for the next hour. And of course, you can tune the program in at WFOV at 12 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday and 12 o'clock at night on Friday. So we do a refeeding of the program to the other network at that time. And then Facebook, you're joining us today, and we're glad to have you as well. And that's something that I never expected. But this studio is one of the unexpected. Things happen here, and always something new. Reminds me, John, of Planet the Elder that said, out of Africa comes something always new. So out of this studio, something always new.
We used it a couple of times, made sure it works. It works pretty good, flawlessly. So we figured, but they won't hear my voice on it. They'll hear yours, but they won't. That microphone there on that camera doesn't pick up my voice. But,
all right. Well, I'm glad that you did that, John. I'm very happy to have the additional feed. We come for those that are joining us for the first time. We do a program here at allpointstv.com. You can pick it up at YouTube at your leisure. And we do a live feed from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock on Mondays. And this program here, I'm going to be dealing with the nonsense of last week in terms of the reparations question. And I'll touch on a few things we talked about last week as well. And what I'll be doing in the program is bringing something together, hopefully to your continued edification, that deals with some of the documentation, since we seem not to want to deal with that little thing called, it's a 5-letter word. You may know all the 4-letter words. The 5-letter word is facts. And so we might want to entertain some of the facts for a change. And I'm going to do that later on. Last week I was talking about, these politicians and how if anyone believes anything that comes out of their mouth, they need to get outside more and get some sunshine, because Walter Williams, as I said last week, is right. When the politicians open their mouths, when they begin to move their lips, that's a clear indication that they are in fact lying. And I got up this morning to hear the news and heard that Bernie Sanders is saying everything is free, as if people do not charge for the services, and we do not have we do not have an ending of slavery in this country. We did have free at one time, but that's when person were on the plantations working and not getting a check for it. Bernie Sanders should read the 13th Amendment. Nothing is free, Mr. Sanders. And this man had the nerve this morning he was on national networks talking about assessing the student loans, the forgiveness programs. He's going to make education free, and he's going to do it by passing the assessment off to Wall Street, $2 trillion passed off to those who don't have the numbers to fight them, to make sure there's nothing coming back to other politicians who would in fact vote this in and then not pay a price for it, because those who are quote unquote in the top 1%, 5%, or 10% that are paying 70% of the taxes in this country, they don't have the numbers to turn these crooked criminal politicians out. And so free means that they will in fact pass the cost on to the taxpayers, and not all of the taxpayers, but the ones who are at least able to defend themselves, and that's the ones at the top that don't have the numbers, but have the productive activity that then accrues a large part of the income because of their greater productivity in the economy. And so they're being punished by these politicians that take their wealth and they get the political benefit redistributing the wealth out to the population in their name, and then they get the political benefit because people run to the polls in essence and then vote for these criminals and keep them in power. Bernie Sanders is an arch criminal, and it's time to point out his nonsense is one of the things that's really affecting this country in a very negative way. But they don't pay a price for it because they don't pick on the ones that have the numbers to, in fact, raise their voice against them. And that's why they go with these groups that do not have the large numbers in it and then charge their excess policies, their programs that cost all this money. They're saying free, but it really is a very costly program. And really, the government is the one that created the student loan crisis. And then they create a problem, as they always do, and then they want to import the solution, is that they are solving a problem, but the problem didn't even exist until they created it. So on the one side, the politicians create a problem, and then on the other side, they import a solution, and everybody's applauding the persons that are solving it without looking at where the problem started in the first place. And I'm an indication of that policy because I went to school before the government got involved in this student loan that they're doing. That a lot of persons were getting student loans and going and paying their rent or partying on the money. And then, of course, the schools react to more funding available, and then they raise their price. So they add on more administrators, and the administrative cost goes up. Everybody's salaries increase. All that's paid for through the student structure. And then Bernie Sanders come behind them and then wants to then do loan forgiveness that the government created and then have somebody paying for the mistake that the politicians made in the first place. If this is not a scam, a hustle on the part of these politicians, nothing is. I was saying last week that anybody that trusts anything a politician says, just needs to go back and look at the history of politicians that are in fact putting their word out here as if their word is bond, and then go and see where their word had any credence in terms of how it played out. Did they in fact keep their word? Were they willing to stand behind what they said? And we need look no further than this book I talked about last week, 100 Years of Dishonor, a book written, it's really called A Century of Dishonor by Helen Hunt Jackson. And so read Helen Hunt Jackson's book, where she was talking about 100 years of where these politicians, not the American people, these politicians in Washington gave their word, and over 100 years of giving their word in one treaty after another, 100 years of having made some decision that they were going to do something a certain way, and then 100 years after that had begun, every word they gave, every treaty they signed was broken. You can't have a record any more absolute than that. And that's why I say anybody believes what a politician says. And it doesn't matter what party they're in. And it's another thing we got to get out of. The idea that one party is better than another party. Both parties are criminals. The political class in this country is a mafia group.
See, after I've seen people get elected. You see that with the Tea Party candidates got elected, and they within a few years they're soon very corrupt. I think was it Ryan? Tom Ryan was Ryan. Paul Ryan. I think he was one of their boys, and he turned rapidly against them. And so it's basically a power seduction. You got all these people around you who they've been enjoying a great with life for generations. We got the Dingle family in Michigan, who has been in power almost uninterrupted since the old man who started the legacy since the time of FDR. That was nearly 80 some years ago. Mm-hmm. So they've been in power almost 80 some years. Royal families and countries don't exist. Some of them don't last that long.
John, the politicians have been in control of the planet ever since we set government up. And that is what the framers understood, and that's what they tried to stop in terms of the experiment over here in the United States was being formed in the country itself broke away in 1776, but it began to be formed as a nation, a United States of America, in 1787 with the Constitutional Convention called in Philadelphia. and the ratification of the Constitution. But if you read it carefully, you'll see that it's crafted by the framers, and their tremendous brilliance is crafted in order to stop government. The 7 articles of the Constitution, if you read every one of the frames of what was the Constitution at the inception of the country, you'll see that every one of the 7 articles of the Constitution was a way of restraining government and trying to keep it from going out of control. Because they were students of history, and they knew that governments had done that in the past, and that politicians had run these governments in the past into the ground with their decision making, because they wield power, and they have the shield, they have the sword, and now they have the guns. And so you have to then, those that are wielding power, that is, say those that are wielding the power of the state, they have to be restrained. And the whole document that they founded in 1787, they drew up in 1787, was one particular after another trying to deal with the question of power in the hands of these politicians, and how to restrain the use of it, because if it's not restrained, it will do what it's done in the past, which we see it doing right now, and that is gone out of control, because that's what politicians do. That's what Bernie Sanders is talking about doing. Talk about this idea of free. What this man is talking about behind this free is he's talking about these guns of the state. They're talking about using the guns of the state to take from one class of the people and distributing in their name to another class of people for political interest and political power wielding. And so there's nothing free. And this idea that they say that it's free is an insult to our intelligence, because we don't see anybody working free, not since 1865. And so we're talking about, if Bernie Sanders is honest, he would come out, if this man was not a criminal using the power of the state, what Bernie Sanders would say is that what we are going to do is going to use the power of the state, the only power in the country that legally has the right to initiate force. We're going to use that power to confiscate the wealth of one group of the people in the country that cannot fight back politically. We're going to confiscate their wealth, and we're going to more widely distribute it out into a larger part of the populace so as to get their votes so that we can stay in power. If he were honest, he would say that. But rather than saying that, he's talking about this stuff is free. This man is one of the biggest liars in Washington. And anyone that is saying free, any politician that uses the word free, the only way that can be so is if he's saying that it comes out of his pocket.
Did you ever hear his video? This is actually him saying this years ago in response to a question about the bloodlines in communist countries. He actually said, well, those bloodlines are good because if it weren't for bloodlines, they just upper class would get to food and not the regular person. Well, I had family living in Hungary. They very, very seldom got enough to they barely lived on it, okay? So and another thing is, you notice those people who are advocating for it never lived in countries where it went on?
Well, and they are not going to live in the country they're calling for here if what they do is obtained. If they actually succeed in what they're trying to do right now, if they try to rescind the verdict of Donald Trump, because we made a great decision in 2016. I don't know if the American people understand what they did and voting Donald Trump into the presidency, and I can't even imagine how bad things would be if we had voted Hillary Clinton in there. We dodged a bullet in 2016. And even though we may not say it now because it's too current to understand all of the particulars of what went on in that particular election, history will in fact treat this moment in time very kindly. Because Donald Trump came from the outside to stop these kleptocrats in government from turning this country into a cesspool, a socialist cesspool. They always claim paradise. They always get the cesspool. They get the government, not of the people, for the people, by the people. They get government of the state, by those who wield power in the state. That means government under the politicians. Another thing about Bernie Sanders is that when Bernie Sanders says that there is democratic socialism, Think about that for a minute. You have the power being wielded by the state, all power that's embraced by the state, and then is going to have a democratic outlook. The people in a social society, their voice is silenced. Yet, in the silencing of their voice, because the state is all-encompassing, they will have a democratic socialist outlet. That's what Bernie Sanders is saying. That socialism is democratic. They like to put that word democratic on it because they know the American people have bought into the idea of democracy, but we don't. But that's not even what we have in this country. That's not what the framers intended, and they were wise in not, in fact, setting it up. The framers were fearful of democracy. That's why it's never mentioned in the two documents that are the founding documents of this country. You won't find it in the Declaration of Independence, and you will not find it in the Constitution of the United States, not mentioned not one time. Article 4, Section 4 says that all states are guaranteed a Republican form of government, not a democracy. And all you have to do is read Federalist Paper 10, which is the first Federalist Papers written by James Madison, and read why they had in there a fear of democracy. Because in the 10th Federalist Paper, they talk about factions. And their fear of factions was that factions can go out of control because each one of them is representing a vested interest. And there's no more dangerous faction than a majority faction. Because of the size of it, it can then silence the voice of anyone that's not a part of that group, and they can silence that voice where that voice need not be heard, and therefore this majority faction can oppress that voice because it cannot, in fact, accrue the numbers that would stop the majority from acting against its interests. So the framers, in their tremendous brilliance, I'm talking about brilliance here. The brilliance that you have, for example, in the Electoral College. That's another thing these silly politicians are talking about changing because they don't understand how brilliant that is. It was a brilliant system put in place by the framers of this country. And the question is that if you set factions up and you have a majority faction, how do you fight it without becoming oppressive in the process? And the brilliance of the founders is that the way you fight factions that can go out of control, because factions are dangerous, because they're serving a certain community of interests to the exclusion of other interests, the way that you fight factions without doing it in an oppressive manner is that you create you create super factions. Rather than having one majority reigning supreme, you create super majorities, multiple majorities, or in the Electoral College, a majority in every state. That's what the Electoral College is. Every majority, no matter how large or how small, must be contended with before you choose a president in this country. And all you out there saying that the Electoral College is oppressive, you don't understand the brilliance of the founders because you're not brilliant yourself. You went to these government schools and got your brainwashing, and you can't think. And the framers did not have that as part of their exercise. They were very clear in their thinking because they're not going to those government schools you're going to right now. And there are people talking about they want to rescind the Electoral College because it's not democratic. It's super democratic. And if you understood it, if you didn't have these bogus diplomas and degrees, you would be able to recognize the brilliance. The Electoral College is a brilliant scheme put out by the framers. And every time you mess with that web put in place by the framers, every time you mess with it, as you did in 1913, with the passage of the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to tax income. Look at the government right now. Look how out of control it is. Then you also, in the same year, 1913, passed the 17th Amendment that rescinded the way we choose senators in this country. Senators were at one time chosen by state legislatures. And the reason why that is true is because they were sent there and were intended to be the representatives of the states representatives. Why? Because the states created the federal government, and they wanted the state representatives to go to Washington where the federal government was, fearful of centralized power. And they wanted the states to have the representatives in Washington where the centralized power was, to hold them accountable. Accountable to whom? To the states. And through the states, we the people of the United States. And they took that away by, in fact, doing away with that process and made them popularly elected as you did the members of the House. The members of the House of Representatives, by the way, were intended to be elected by people in the various districts, close to the people. So in every district in the states, in those districts where those politicians were mostly held close to the voters, those districts sent the people's representatives sent to the Congress their representatives. But on a larger scale, on the micro scale, you had the representatives. On the macro scale, the state scale, you had the politicians. On the statewide, everybody vote for the state politicians, and you send them representing the states to Washington, D.C. That was the idea. And they changed that in 1917, and now we have the people in the Congress chosen the same way in the Senate as they're chosen in the House, which was never intended by the framers. And the problem with that is not only they changed that, but in changing that, they didn't see the contradiction in having changed it by not changing the 6-year term of the senators. If you change the way we choose the senators in this country, then the terms of the senators have to be changed also then, because they no longer are the representative of the state, which is what was intended by the senators. So if they're not going to be that, and you vote them in as the representatives in the same process that you vote for the House of Representatives, then you must in fact take out the 6-year term. Because the 6-year term was put there because as the state representatives, they were given a term of service longer than that of the president. That's why the members of the House serve 2 years, the president serves 4 years, but the Senate, the state's representatives, serve 6 years because they are the officers of the states or the officers of that which created the federal government. And so their representatives were to, in fact, subsume the number of years over and above those of the members of the House and those of the president, because the states were to be in charge here. And you ask a question when you look at Article 1, Section 8, you ask this question of who is that in fact delegating these powers in Article 1, Section 8? When they say that Congress shall have the power to, and they list 17 things there, and then necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, you ask the question, who's doing delegation of powers here? Where are those powers being enumerated from? An enumeration of those powers specifically delegated to the federal government. They're dictating to the federal government. Who is that doing the delegation? Who is that doing the dictation to the federal government? And the answer is the states are doing it. They're telling the federal government, out of which the states created this centralized authority, they're telling them what is accruing to them from the states and what powers they have acting in the name of the states, which is the creator of the federal government, and what they can do and what cannot do. Those things that are delegated to them specifically in the Constitution, those things, in fact, are delegated to the federal government. Those that are not delegated, those things then are reserved to the states or to the people therein. And they're very clear about that. And they reiterated that point in Amendment 10 when they were talking about all powers that's not delegated to the federal government nor prohibited to the states are therefore to be assumed to be held by the states and to the people therein those states. That's the Constitution of the United States. What they've done is they've done what politicians have always done. They've slid from underneath the restraints placed on their power, and that's what the framers feared. And we're now at that moment in time. That's why we got Bernie Sanders talking that nonsense that he's talking. Okay, I want to spend a lot of time though on this fiasco that occurred last week, a travesty that occurred last week by a subcommittee. Okay, we're going to take a break with coming up on a break with WFOV, and they take their break at the 26-minute mark, and they will be back in 4 minutes, and we will welcome them back at that time. We won't be very far, as always. We always say that we're not going to be very far away. We try to stay within the vicinity where you were when you left. So when you come back in 4 minutes, we'll be back around the same place where you were when you left for your 4-minute break. See you after 4 minutes. We're going to continue here at allpointstv.com. And also, I want to welcome aboard the Facebook audience, which is new today, and we're very glad to have you aboard the allpointstv.com train. You can pick us up on YouTube for other programs that you might have missed in the past, and they're there for your listening and visual enjoyment. I want to take this time also to tell you that we want you to watch all the programs here because there are some very good programs at the studio. We're an alternative news site, and we're doing some programs they're not doing anywhere else. And I can guarantee you, without a shadow of a doubt, that nobody's going to cover the reparations hearing the way it's going to be covered right here, because we're going to go into some of the documentation and show how bogus this nonsense was last week. And I don't mind telling you that this was another scam run by these politicians who are doing whatever they can to pull out all the corks so as to be able to win in 2020. They're pulling out all the barriers, and that may have caused their defeat in 2016. They're trying to reduce that number of voters that went to the polls. That's really why they lost in 2016. They lost because 63 million Americans went to the polls and said that they are not going to take it anymore. And they went to the polls and turned against the politician, the political class, and went to an outsider. Think about that for a minute. A man who never held an elective office in his entire life. I don't know, he was elected to his class in high school. Never held a political office. This man was voted in from the outside. What does that tell you? It doesn't tell you anything about the Russians. It tells you what the people think about these politicians in Washington, D.C. They know the people are waking up. A lot of people are woke. W-O-K-E. And more awakening every day, and that's why they had that reparations conference last Wednesday. I'm gonna read. We're gonna get into. I'm gonna get into the history of it in terms of this bogus claim being made by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who reminds me of what was said by Booker T. Washington in 1911, who said in that year, the great Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee Institute in 1881, July the 4th, by the way, 1881, founder of Tuskegee Institute, and Booker T. Washington said in 1911, 4 years before his untimely death, that there's a class of Negroes, the word he used at that time, he says a class of Negroes who have found they can make a living by holding up in front of the country the Negro's grievance. And he said that they do not want the Negro to lose their grievance because they don't want to lose their job. And 108 years later, the words that Booker T. Washington said on that occasion, those words are still as true today as it was then. You still got a segment of Negroes, and Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of them. And so they had this charade, this scam last week called by Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. Okay, we're going to welcome back WFOV. We're very glad you came back, and you're very good about doing that. Whenever you take your break, we know on the other side of it you'll be back with us at that time, so we're very glad you came back again, and we are going to continue what we're saying here. Sheila Jackson Lee, who convened who called for this conference. She was not the one that chaired it. The chair was this chicken eater, Stephen Cohen. This man is a national. These people are national embarrassments. You probably remember Stephen Cohen, who was calling Bar a chicken for not going up there and coming back in front of these gangsters to testify about what? Testify about a report. We can read it ourselves. And those of us that read it, I've read most of it. I didn't read the whole report. I read 2/3 of it. I certainly read the second part. But when I saw in the first part that the conclusion was no collusion, then I kind of read that in piecemeal. But the second part of 200 pages in a 448-page report, I read every part of the second part of the report, because that's what they were saying, that Bob did not Bob, but Mueller had not made up his mind. They said that he alluded to 10 possible cases of obstruction of justice, but he never drew the conclusion. And when they said Barr had, in fact, lied about the report, I want to read that for myself, and I can tell you what Barr said in the summation of the report is exactly what Mueller did. Mueller didn't make any conclusion about it. But if you read the evidence in that report, you see that the conclusion was drawn was exactly correct, because Mueller did not make a conclusion. And why didn't he do it? It wasn't sufficient evidence to do so. In fact, there was no evidence to do so. If you want the long and short of it, is that no evidence showed there was any evidence of obstruction. Because number one, you can't obstruct an unjust hearing in the first place, because there's no predicate upon which the hearing was held. Because the hearing was the investigation was bogus at the outset. And so Donald Trump is not obstructing justice by, in fact, refuting it. The man is defending himself. I think we have that under the Constitution, don't we? In terms of a person having a right, not only through a trial by jury, but a right to defend himself against charges. We have due process in this country, in the Fifth Amendment and also the 14th Amendment. And that's what Donald Trump was, in fact, doing. But to say that you are not guilty of the charges, that's obstruction in the case of people like this criminal out of New York, Gerald Nadler, and this criminal who was in the subcommittee last week holding this reparations conference, Stephen Cohen, the chicken eater. This man was eating chicken on the floor of the Congress, in a committee of the Congress. This is a national embarrassment of these people inside of the government.
I'm going to interrupt you. You had a question coming from somebody on All Points Facebook page about I believe it was about the income tax. Was that amendment ever really fully ratified? I understand it wasn't.
John,
yeah.
These politicians, see, that's what I'm talking about. Look, you're dealing with people that are sleight of hand gangsters. They are the ones that, when J. Edgar Hoover wrote his book called Masters of Deceit, he wasn't talking about them, but I can apply his title to these people. These are the masters of deceit. These persons are the original, these people, the politicians are the original magicians. They are able to make reality disappear. And so in terms of the 16th Amendment, the process is, and it's explained in the 5th article of the Constitution, to amend the Constitution, there are 4 processes that you can use in order to do it. We've only used one of them. And that is 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate will propose an amendment. So 2/3 of the members of the House, today there will be 290 because there are 435 members in the House. And then in the Senate, there are 100 members today. And so you have 2/3 of the Senate, 67 members. So 290 in the House and 67 in the Senate. They will, in fact, make a proposal to amend the Constitution. Then, after they have, in fact, proposed it, is then sent to the states. Look at that again now. The states, The states are the ones in charge of the ratification of the proposal. The states did not, in fact, give that power away. They maintain it among themselves because they are the ones who are supposed to be in charge, not Washington. The states. And I wish they had not changed the language of we the people, although that's the ideal, but the states are the embodiment of the people. But the original document will say we the states. Okay, I don't want to get off what the question is, but I want you to understand a more expansive have a more expansive understanding here. That's how you amend the Constitution. 2/3 of the states, 3/4 of the states. That means 38 states today, if they want to change the Constitution, let's say we'll have an amendment. You'd have to have an amendment to, let's say we will amend the Constitution and make it the 28th Amendment. We got 27 amendments right now. So let's say we have a 28th Amendment. Let's say we do what Donald Trump is proposing. We will amend the Constitution in order to make it unconstitutional to burn the flag. And why do you need an amendment? Because of the criminals on the Supreme Court. These gangsters on the Supreme Court, those are gangsters too. Only one or two of them on the court really are carrying out their constitutional responsibilities. Clarence Thomas, I know you don't like him. And to an extent, not to a large extent, it's only, really, you only have one person on the Constitution that is an originalist. Well, maybe two now because Gorsuch, to an extent. But the rest of those persons on there, not John Roberts, and let me tell you something else. Not this person that you were fighting over to get on that court. Not Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh is a John Roberts camp member, and he is showing that he's not a conservative. This guy is voting with on that liberal strain of the court, and all of that liberal strain of the court is criminal. But that's what the framers were trying to stop. Anyway, the states are the ones that are the embodiment of the amendment process because they are the ones that have to then, the way the policy is set up, they are the ones that have to okay what they've done in the nation's capital. They have to come back to the states for the approval of what they did in Washington. You see that? Washington must check with the states for the approval of its behavior. And if anybody think that Washington is going to be the total custodian of his own power and they're going to wield power responsibly when they are the ones who are authoring whether or not it is constitutional or not, if we think we're going to get justice out of that process by them determining it in Washington, don't hold your breath because it's not going to happen. So was the 16th Amendment ratified? Let me give you the long and short of it. The long and short of it is no. They did that when Congress was in recess and said they had the number of states that ratified. Let's go down the road and see if they did that. Did they have 3/4 of the states? They'd have to have 38 states. Today. Did they have the 3/4 of the states at that time in 1916? No, they did not. They declared it had passed. And anyone that's read that history will know that that ratification never took place. It never happened. The masters of the seat, they're experts at it. The reality has disappeared because the politicians were in control of the process. And I'll tell you another thing. We've tried, Mark Levine has called for through his book, The Liberty Amendments, and I'm a part of that committee, by the way, trying to get a constitutional convention. But I'm going to tell you something we got to watch out for. The way you call a convention is when 2/3 of the states will petition the Congress to convene a constitutional convention. if you think that they're going to be up there, open up those ballots, that petition, and they're going to count that they got 2/3 of the states. I wish we'd have 2/3 of the states, and then we ask them to do a roll call. See, we don't even know right now how many states have passed through their state legislatures a request that we propose a constitutional convention. We can go around Congress. We can petition Congress to call a constitutional convention, where then to revise the Constitution, we can have 2/3 of state conventions. See, we don't have to have 2/3 of the Congress. We can have 2/3 of state conventions, but make a proposal. And then it's ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. That process has never been used, and I can guarantee you it's never going to be talked about. Just like last week, there's one person called in last week, and he asked about the cryptocurrency. You know what? Go read the paper today. The politicians are outraged over that because the monopoly money they created. Because we don't have money these gangsters are so criminal. That's why you talk about that's why people talk about Democrat and Republican. You have to be out of your mind. They've driven you out of your mind. There are no Democrats in the Democratic Party, and there are no Republicans in the Republican Party. You can forget that. Just cause I say it's not what you call me with, it's what I answer to. Well, they answer to Democrats and Republicans, but that's not what they are. There are no Democrats in Congress.
Just follow the money. They're in it for themselves. I mean, they start out with nothing in office. They leave after a few years, even if they get booted out. They're worth millions, and that happens more times than not. So that's what they're for. They wanted to say "for me" party. That's it. That's it. That's all they are.
They hope people's eyes. They hope not more people get woke. So you woke. I'm woke. And I'm going to show you how woke I am in terms of that farce they had last week because you didn't see what they were doing. You know what, John? By the way, what they were doing is what they have right now is they have an overground railroad. You heard the Underground Railroad, John?
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, the Underground Railroad, by the way, is a myth. It never existed. They made that up. There was no Underground Railroad. I can document that. That's another myth of history. What those slaves did is they took their head, took their arms, took their bodies, and with their feet they ran off with it. Now you say Underground Railroad, what you really are talking about there, listen carefully, what you're talking about there are those sanctuary cities. Once they went to the north and escaped, then you had some recompense from people that would hire them out and get them to stay up hidden until they could go across the water to Canada. But in terms of there being a network from one house to another, they just jumping from one house to another and then escaping through people helping them out in the South, who would have done that? And how would that network have existed in the South at that time? The Underground Railroads are total myth. And I will not only say that, I'll document it. Go read the book by Larry Garrow, G-A-R-A, called The Liberty Line. So when I come to the studio, I don't come here disarmed. Go read Larry Garrow's book, G-A-R-A, called The Liberty Line. That's a brilliantly written book. I can name others as well, and you can read the slave narratives. Go read who helped Douglass escape? What underground network did Douglass use? What about Henry Box Brown, the one that had his friends put him in a box and mail him to a city in the north, put it on the outside of the box. Do not turn the box upside down. They didn't know what was inside the box, but they had on there on the outside of the box, do not turn upside down. Because if he had done that in the minutes inside the box hiding out, he would have bled to death. His brain would have exploded. All the blood rushing down into his head. He shipped himself to the north. And when he got there, they received him and they knocked on the box and asked him if he was in there. If he was all right. And he said, I'm all right. Shipped himself to the north. Then they look at Harriet Tubman, the single person that went into the South and brought person out of the South and so on and so forth, out of her own wits. And they want to use her as a conductor of the Underground Railroad. Pure nonsense. There were no conductors. The slaves conducted themselves. Go read the slave narratives about this and see where any one of those. Go read the book by Gil Osowski called Putting on Old Massa. Or go read the book called Bullwhip Days. Or Lay My Burden Down. What's the book by... Okay, those are just some of the works. Go to the Library of Congress and read those slave narratives that were in fact recorded by the Harlem Renaissance writers, who were given an assignment during Roosevelt's term to go and interview the slaves who were still alive at that time. Okay, no, we didn't ratify the 16th Amendment, and that's another sleight of hand trick done by the politicians, who then were able to, behind the American people's back, vote themselves the money and put their hands in our pockets, which was never intended by the framers. They never intended to have the federal government the right to jump over the states into the pockets of those who live in the states. They wanted to have the states as a barrier from the politicians of the nation's capital. And the way they got their money was by the import tax and by selling federal lands. They were not even allowed to put an export tax on products going out of the country. And I have to tell you something, a little secret. The reason why the South rose up against these criminals, the Kennedy brothers, Donald and Ronald Kennedy in North Carolina, you're right in your book. The South was right. Because the South rose up against these people, picked up their guns against them. And you can talk that slavery talk to somebody that does not understand the record, but I'm woke.
Your stance right there kind of would alienate you from a lot of the Republicans out there that,
John, it alienates me from 99% of these Negroes in this country. And you know what? Jimmy Crack Corn. What's the other part of that?
And I don't care.
Because I know and they don't know. I better get... Okay, so let me just summarize by saying this. It was never ratified because you have to have a certain number of states to give their consent to do so, to, in fact, amend the Constitution. And those persons in 1913 did not have that number of votes to do that. They lied about the process, and that ratification never did take place. So even the taxation of that. So when you say that we're being taxed illegitimately in the country by the income tax of the federal government. But that's what the South was objecting to. The Constitution does not allow for the federal government to invoke a disproportionate tax among the states. And they realized they could not do that. So what they did is they put a tax on the tariffs coming into the country, which then would make the countries that are importing goods to this country then tax the products coming out of the country. And so you could, if you understand how the taxation occurred, where they were taxing around the Constitution, how I got around it, is that they had the export of the products out of the South, the importing countries, they were importing the South's goods, they were taxing those products and then using that taxation from the South to pay the import tax on the goods they were importing into the North. So you can see how they got around the Constitution. And that's why the South picked up its guns. Because the South was paying for the prosperity of the North. And if anybody doubt my words, go back and look at when they were objecting in 1824 when no one was talking about slavery. Look at the tariff of 1824, the tariff of 1828, and the tariff of 1832 that they passed in order to lessen the anger in the South. They passed a tax in 1832 in order to lower the taxes that the South was being forced to pay through the import taxation policies, through the fact that they were taxing imports, and then by taxing imports, they were taxing us on the other side. The South was being taxed in Europe because their goods were being exported and imported into Europe, exported out of this country, imported into Europe. And so that taxation was being wielded by the South, and the South was paying for the Europe was paying for the import tax they were paying into the North by having the money they took from the South in the import tax, paying that for their imports, paying their exports of those products going into the North from the European theater. You can see how, if you understand how it worked, the taxes are now circular, going from the South paying an import tax into Europe, Europe paying an export tax into the North, those taxes now being placed in the northern coffers, restricted by being direct by the Constitution, couldn't do it through the constitutional mandates. The way they got around it was by doing a circular taxation policy through which the South began to object. That's why they're calling these tariffs a tariff of abomination. That's why South Carolina is objecting to it. South Carolina being a harbor town, Charlotte, South Carolina. I was there to do a report for the university when I was there 2 or 3 years ago. I've been to Fort Sumter there also, went there to see what happened there. But I'm telling you that these gangsters found a way, and they continue to look at ways, they found a way to get around the Constitution, and they did so by having the taxes circular, so it would not look like it's a violation, but the South saw it as a violation. They understood exactly what was going on. And they called those tariffs of abomination, because that's exactly what they were. They were taxing the South to the benefit of the North. And the South, first of all, tried to, of course, the South was outnumbered. If you wouldn't have had, by the way, you would not have had a so-called civil war if George Mason had prevailed, his voice had prevailed at the Constitutional Convention. But his voice was voted down, and that's why George Mason, who was really the father of the Constitution, George Mason, the father of the Constitution, James Madison, the one that would have pushed it through 29 of the Federalist Papers that he wrote, that would have sanctioned it through his writing, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, who wrote 5 of them. Hamilton wrote 29, and Hamilton wrote 51. Let me get this straight: 51 by Alexander Hamilton, 29 by James Madison, and 5 written by John Jay. Madison is the father of the Constitution, not because he was the one that brought the particulars together so much, but the one through his writing and through his proselytization of it, and his role at the Constitutional Convention. They say he's the father. The real father is George Mason. And if they had taken George Mason's word, we would never had a civil war in this country. We would have gotten rid of the slaves in this country the same way they got rid of slaves in all other parts of the world. It would have been democratized by the Industrial Revolution. And that's what ended it where it was ended throughout. That's why it was ended in the West. And it would have been ended here in the same way if this criminal, Abraham Lincoln, had not gotten in the way. I'm telling you the absolute truth, Facebook. I'm back on here. John, I'm back on there. So I'm just telling you, again, you silence me because I wrote wrote on there about the real problem that black people are facing in this country. And the real problem that black people are facing is liberalism by these gangsters. Okay, so anyway, let me get to what I really want to talk about. I want to talk about this scam, because there is an overground railroad right now, and the leader of that is not Harriet Tubman, it's Candace Owens. There's a Brexit going on, and this hearing was held last week to maintain the slaves in the new cotton patch, run by modern-day Democrats who ran the Democratic Party back in that time period, that plantation back in that time period. The same plantation dwellers, the modern ones, are the ones that ran the charade last week because they had a problem with their slaves, those that are enslaved on the Democratic Party's plantation, the one that is no longer cotton picking, but vote picking. And next week, when I get a chance to now go into it further, I will, in fact, bring my documents to bear upon the situation, because I plan to uncover the charade and therefore uncover what Ta-Nehisi Coates was doing last week in this scam he was running last week. Okay, we'll get to it next week. We're still going to continue these conversations. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.